Hello, everyone. I was just whispering in someone's ear that I feel like your resident economic imposter because I'm not actually a member of the SDP, but as William and Rod know very well, I sympathise particularly with a lot of your cultural values and just simply the fact that you have values. So thank you, William, so much for inviting me to speak today, and thank you all for being willing to listen to an imposter, which not many people are willing to do. So I had a chat with William over the phone a few weeks ago about what I was going to talk about today. And the Queen had just died. So there was only one thing on my mind, and that was time, specifically the passing of it and our place in it. There are rare moments of rupture in our lives. These moments interject in a way that transcends all of our daily concerns and momentarily broaden our vision, revealing things in their correct proportions. We're currently living in a cost of living crisis, as Joe mentioned earlier, and yet at the Queen's death, people were inspired to drop everything that they were doing, no matter how urgent, and come from all parts of the country and even the world to descend on London to join a queue of hundreds of thousands of people that moved continuously day and night for days. These moments remind you that your feet are on the ground at this particular place, at this particular time in history, that thousands of years, millennia, surround us of our history, and that your hands and your mind are here right now, and that you're part of it. This interjection makes certain demands on you. It compels you to do something for it. Ironically, given the increased accessibility of information, we are numbed to a sense of historical perspective, perhaps more than any previous generation. We have the facts, but the feeling doesn't really come so easily to us anymore. We view ourselves as being modern and therefore somehow outside of time. And that's hardly surprising, given our way of life, if you step back and take a look at us. People are atomized and detached. Our focus is stolen by constant stimulation and entertainment, by an unrelenting deluge of information. Lives are lived in front of a screen. Cheap but instant gratification is always a click away. We live in ugly beehive housing built to last tens of years, if you're lucky, rather than hundreds. Everything feels fleeting and transient. Anything old is bad and suspect. Activists demand that history must be edited to conform with the endless present in which the party is always right, to quote Orwell. So the public space increasingly represents one ideologically accredited version of the present and of history, and gives people no opportunity to experience themselves in the context of time. Education is the same sad story. In museums, and as we walk down the street, it's all the same. We're surrounded by ugliness. You look around at the grey cardboard cutout inhumane buildings, and in them you can see the stooped posture of a culture that has simply given up on itself and doesn't respect itself, and it all feels a bit mentally unwell. This kind of environment doesn't lend itself to a profound experience of time because it is a nowhere, as Rod said earlier. It's a nowhere place. It makes you want to close your eyes and feel nothing except whatever transitory pleasures are on offer. How can you feel the demands of generational responsibility when that bleak feeling is stuck in your chest? It's just so uninspiring. We've created a culture that has produced a juvenile mass who find it difficult to see what is really valuable in life. It's all about now and me. This is a spiritually malnourished existence, and it is entirely self-inflicted. So let's journey to a different place, a nicer place together. A few weeks ago, I was in Wiltshire for the Common Sense Society's Britannia Fellowship, and we were staying at Bowood House in Wiltshire. It's a beautiful 18th century estate with rolling hills, a cathedral-like arboretum, an enormous lake that was dug by hand. The gardens were created by Capability Brown, the famous landscape gardener. Our guide explained that the plans for the garden used maps with tiny marks on showing where the seeds had been planted. And so I asked her, how long until these trees mature? 100 years. So I asked, that means that Capability Brown and his clients never saw their creation fully come into being. No, they didn't. Apologies to any gardeners for this next description, but they didn't have the technology at the time to transplant trees. Where we saw pastoral perfection, they would have seen a sparse landscape of saplings. So much was invested by that family who owned the estate. All of those local hands digging out the lake before modern machinery. They knew that they would never see it in its full glory. That pleasure was ours in 2022, the day before Queen Elizabeth II died. The next day, our group was tucked away in a small room, a little dot in the fields of Wiltshire. We were in the late Sir Roger Scruton's office, tucked into every spare space around a piano, listening to a performance of Purcell. The sunlight was coming in through the door from where the orchard is, where we'd just been picking apples with Sophie, Roger's wife. That was when I got a text implying that the death of the Queen was imminent. The signal was bad, so I wasn't sure, and for half an hour it felt like being suspended in some ghostly, timeless place, unexpectedly leaving an era, unknowingly in a new one. Why am I telling you this? You don't have to be particularly observant to see that we're in the midst of a long drawn-out political and cultural crisis, and I think Joanna was absolutely right to say this is actually a moral crisis. The current situation has had a very long run-up. The 2 world wars led us to lose our confidence. The 1960s brought us relativism, which compounded that by eroding our values. The foundational institution of society, the family, that which connects us to the past and to the future, was broken. The 1990s saw mass migration that altered towns and cities at an unbelievably disruptive pace. It brought different cultures and values that led to debates about compatibility and integration that forced us into defining ourselves, but we defied definition. We heard, integrate into what exactly? We were told repeatedly that we have no culture. The best definition we could come up with was a sloppy, abstract set of ill-defined liberal values, and that didn't even touch on the truth of who we are as we know ourselves to be. The 2000s brought us radical movements like Islamism, but we could see no way to justify properly defending ourselves. Defend what, after all? The 2010s and 2020s brought us identity politics on steroids, which we've already heard a lot about today. We went from being told that we didn't really exist to being told that everything about our history was problematic and evil. So here we are now, with Liz Truss trying to heave us out of stagflation. But it's clear that we are in a deeper mire that we have to free ourselves from. And that can't be achieved in an election cycle. It can't be achieved in a lifetime of election cycles. It's something like the socio-cultural equivalent of stagflation. And we can't escape it if our understanding of investment is purely economic and political. Politicians think in election cycles rather than generations. Our imagination of what is possible has become so short-sighted that we've practically plucked our own eyes out. Politically, we behave actually like someone who's depressed. Small tasks seem insurmountably large. Getting out of bed and getting washed is just too painful. How could we possibly accomplish great things? Of course, Britain is over. She's finished. If you take the long view, to look beyond your own lifetime, however, and see how much infinite time stretches out before us, this silly defeatist attitude is clearly a self-fulfilling prophecy. The ultimate investment that can be made is in the family. It's the most immediate experience of what Edmund Burke understood as the contract between the dead, living, and unborn. The family shouldn't be an afterthought, it should be the centre. But actually, you could argue that in all of what I've described, it's actually the family that has suffered the most. That investment requires effort on the part of you, on the part of every single individual, and it's not something that can simply be left up to government. We are simply not having children. Children are viewed as an interruption to life rather than life itself. The word communities is tossed around by politicians as an abstract. Communities require work, and many people seem to have forgotten that. It's juvenile, but they expect that it's somehow going to be magically done by someone else. You've heard the phrase, probably, adulting, and that's symptomatic, I think. Millennials are struggling to parent themselves, never mind children. I keep seeing signs everywhere saying things like, coffee worth getting out of bed for, and growing up sucks. You can go to Paddington Station and see that sign. This kind of nonsense breeds mediocrity. Instead, we need to nurture a culture that actually valorizes taking on responsibilities. Truly great things can only be achieved over generations, and politics can only sustain so much when culture goes awry. For that, you need families and courageous individuals who are willing to step up to the plate rather than shy away. We set our expectations far too low, and we're afraid of discipline. As well as looking forward, I think we need to look back. I'm constantly struck by how arrogant it is to think that the past has nothing to teach us. We think that we can do it all from scratch, that we know better because it's 2022. We are a Promethean generation. God is dead, and we've replaced him with ourselves. We believe that we can change ourselves endlessly, as Mary Harrington put it, editing our meat avatar. And this is all based on false premises. The basis of this worldview is just simply false. We are temporal creatures living in a limited reality, and if we want to achieve great things as a country and as a people, we have to think in generational terms. To misappropriate St. Paul, we need to wean ourselves off milk and get back onto the solid food. As a culture, I think we've regressed, and now urgently, pardon my language, we need to grow the hell up. The real art of governance is less like running a business and more like creating a garden. Imagine trying to make the case in our KPI-focused world to invest in something that you will never see mature. But this is exactly the investment that we need. We need to be content with planting seeds for the pleasure of others rather than ourselves. And the good news is, the genuinely empowering news, is that each and every person in this room can do something about that. And in fact, I think it's quite clear from today that everyone in this room is doing something about that. At that fellowship in Wiltshire, one of our faculty said something to me that stuck. He said that a culture is something that you have to live every day. You have to engage, you have to go out, you have to build that family, you have to build that community. You have to take the long view, take on responsibility, step up to your duties and serve. And the Queen was a perfect example of that. A culture is only living if you live it. And I think that people need to realize how important they are in history and how much a normal life, well lived, is actually extraordinary by virtue of its normality. We can't be pinned down and understood by some pencil-pushing technocrat. We shouldn't expect to be. We just need to get on with it. So let me end on some wisdom from Sir Roger Scruton, who said, "Social traditions exist because they enable society to reproduce itself. Destroy them heedlessly, and you remove the guarantee offered by one generation to the next. Societies endure only when they are devoted to future generations, and they collapse like the Roman Empire when the pleasures and fancies of the living usurp the inheritance of the unborn." Thank you.